Saint Therese of Lisieux. On November 20th, 1888, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in a letter to the Danish historian of literature, George Brandes, "I have now revealed myself, and I have done it with a cynicism which will have its effects on the course of history. The name of the book is Esse Homo, and it represents a sort of assassination without any mercy for the crucified one. It ends with thunder and lightning against anything which is Christian or in a way contaminated by Christianity. Now at last, I have become the first psychologist of Christianity. I am an old artilleryman, and I draw up heavy guns of whose existence no enemy of Christianity would ever have dreamed. The whole thing is a prelude to the revaluation of all values, a work which I have already finished. I tell you that within 2 years I'll have the whole earth in convolutions." About the same day on which Nietzsche wrote this, an unknown lady of the French provincial middle class, a Madame Guérin, received a letter dated November 18th from her niece, Therese Martin, a 15-year-old postulant in the Carmel of Lisieux. This is what Therese said in her letter. "This morning at communion, I prayed hard to Jesus to fill you to the full with his joys. Alas, joys are not what he has been sending us for some time. It is the cross, and only the cross, that he gives us to rest upon. Oh, my dearest aunt, if it were only that I must suffer, I would not mind. But I know the great part you take in our trial. I should like to take every sorrow from you for your feast, to take all your burdens to myself. That is what a moment ago I was asking of him, whose heart was beating in unison with mine. I felt then that suffering was the very best gift he had to give us, that he gave it only to his chosen friends. His answer made clear to me that my prayer was not granted, for I saw that Jesus loved my dear aunt too much to take away her cross." The two letters quoted here, written nearly simultaneously, are remarkably dissimilar in content and in mood. They really are, as the saying goes, poles apart, and it is not difficult to see that everything which has occurred in the history of the world since that November 1888 has occurred in between these two poles. To be sure, it is quite unfair to Nietzsche to quote him in such a manner. That letter was written shortly before the outbreak of his mental illness, hence the extravagance of phrase, although the content reflects a good deal of the thought of the writer's creative years. Moreover, it reveals only one side of this remarkable thinker. He has, on other occasions, written on Christ and Christianity in a way which is nearly the opposite of our quotation. Moreover, there were virtuous sides to his life, and he was anything but the nihilist or the immoralist which the uninitiated reader might surmise behind those lines. He was a truly modern man. He was not only complex, but he allowed his complexity to get the better of him. He finally broke under the weight of a paradox. This is the reason why one cannot really quote him with any fairness. And any quotation, no matter from which one of his works, would contradict another quotation. In a way, one always quotes him out of context. Not so Therese Martin. Our quotation is a fair sample. It is quite impossible to be unfair to her by quoting her out of context because, in a sense, one is always in context. She said at one time that she began to accept the love of Christ and his cross at the age of 3. She died at the age of 24 under incredible suffering with the words, "My God, I love you." In other words, the writer of the first letter is typical of all of us modern people by the many facets of his personality, the multiple roots of his thought, and his glittering complexity. The writer of the second one showed, in contrast to this, a remarkable single-mindedness. This single-mindedness becomes more startling the more one gets acquainted with Saint Therese. To be sure, single-mindedness was not natural with her. If it were, it would hardly constitute a heroic virtue. Precocious geniuses in music or in mathematics are also single-minded. In fact, they often make great material sacrifices in order to pursue their vocation. In a sense, they live heroic lives. But I do not think that they ever have serious temptations. Let us say, on account of poverty, to give up music or painting and go in for banking. Not so Saint Therese. From the meager hints she gives us, it becomes obvious that she must have been tortured to the limit by the possibilities of many other lives she could have led, the life of the world, the life of natural peace and happiness as she had known it in the home of her childhood, the life of a housewife and a mother. Saints are the geniuses of religion, but not all geniuses of religion are saints. In fact, there are precocious mystics, very much as there are precocious musicians or precocious mathematicians. Gordini speaks of religiously talented people. It is highly probable that there is, on the natural plane, a gift for mysticism as there is a gift for playing chess. From this point of view, the whole Martin family was not unlike one of those families of talented musicians. To use an American idiomatic expression, little Therese was a natural. But, and this is the way in which saints differ essentially from other geniuses, her single-mindedness, her monolithic life, was most strenuously acquired and had to be reconquered every day in a struggle for which there is only one word: mortal. We should not underestimate the sufferings of the geniuses or underrate their merits, but they are naturals and, in a way, always remain naturals. They are never tempted to be non-geniuses. Not so the saints. If they are naturals, as Saint Therese obviously was, they cannot afford to remain so. They are tempted to be non-saints almost every second of their lives. The fact that Saint Therese's simple life was a most bitter and terrible conquest is not at all obvious from her writings. You can read a lot of her letters and a large part of her autobiography and never guess the existence of potential negation. From that early age of 3 to her death at 24, she seems to have been flying in a straight line towards a goal, unwavering, like a homing bird whose instinct does not present him with alternatives. The deception is emphasized by her style of expression. This brings us to another point. When we compare the two quotations given in the beginning, we are struck by an obvious difference, not only in content but also in expression. Although Nietzsche's letter is far from showing him at his best as a writer, there is something very personal and provocative in the way in which he expresses himself. The quotation from Therese Martin, on the other hand, sounds like a religious cliché. One has the feeling that letters like this must have been written by thousands of French girls to thousands of aunts at all times. Now, this apparent lack of originality is a most important feature of her personality, of her life, and of the effect she has had on people. The word original is derived from origin, and the paradoxical fact exists that those who go straight towards the origin are, in temporal terms, quite often unoriginal. After all, Christ himself has summed up the law and the prophets in 2 sentences, and there is not much variety of expression possible. But there seems to be an infinite variety in the possibilities of being different. Nietzsche's attack on Christianity was highly original. He had an angle entirely his own. So had Voltaire, so had Lenin, and so had Bertrand Russell. Even people of much lesser intelligence, when they come out with platitudes along those lines, always seem to manage to sound smart. They have it all over a Carmelite nun, particularly if that Carmelite nun couches her statements in poetic language. The poetic taste of the middle class of the French province, the flowers, the perfumes, and the toys, and all the other sweet and little things of this world, is an obstacle for a great number of people. It was an obstacle for me. Moreover, it emphasized the surface lack of originality, that such a searing flame should have hidden under the camouflage of fin de siècle ornaments is somehow a challenge to us modern people. It is not at all smart. It is a trial to our intellectual pride. Her apparent lack of originality is so significant because it adds another element of anonymity. It is this hiddenness which is so important in the picture of Saint Therese of the infant Jesus and the Holy Face. Hiddenness, for some reason, seems to be an essential element in the economy of salvation. Abraham was a big herdsman, but he was nothing compared with the powerful Chaldeans and the other nations of his time. He was told, "In thee shall all the kindred of the earth be blessed." Genesis 12:3. And look up to the heaven and number the stars. If thou canst, so shall thy seed be. The Jewish people were the smallest, most insignificant tribe in the Near East. They were altogether inconspicuous within the framework of the political history of their time. The Blessed Virgin was an unknown and hidden girl when she received the salutation from the angel. People often do not realize that Christ himself, in terms of temporal fame, and in terms of political history was quite unknown. There is hardly any reference to him in Roman history books of the time. You may remember Anatole France's famous story, The Procurator of Judea. In it, we meet Pontius Pilate as a retired civil servant who lives in a health resort and nurses his arthritis. A friend from the time of Pilate's procuratorship in Judea meets him and reminds him of several incidents of those bygone years. The friend brings up, quite incidentally, the case of Jesus. Pontius Pilate tries hard to remember, but finally, the old civil servant who has had so many legal cases to deal with admits, "I do not recall him." The great skeptic Anatole France has here, with artistic intuition, given us an eternal truth. Compared with the matters of state of the Roman Empire, Jesus was nothing. He never made the headlines, to use the current expression. The procurator, Pontius Pilate, in order to remember, would have to look up the old files, provided there were any left. It is most important to realize that within the colossal imperial machinery of Rome, the story of the man with the blood-stained face, mocked by occupation troops, is not much more than a police incident. Thus we see that a curious incongruity exists between the political and the spiritual history of mankind. It seems almost as if a thing to be world-shaking in spiritual terms had to be inconspicuous and unknown in temporal terms. Those who are familiar with Saint Therese's life remember the incident when she was on her sick bed and overheard the remarks of young novices outside her window. It is customary that after the death of a nun, the superior should send a death notice with a biographical note to other communities. Referring to this, one of the novices said, "I really wonder sometimes what our mother prioress will find to say about Sister Therese when she dies. She has certainly never done anything worth speaking of." This remark, in the light of subsequent events, sounds somewhat like the punchline in Anatole France's story. Sister Therese was happy over hearing this. Complete and utter anonymity was one of the essential features of her way. It is one of the elements of littleness, that concept of hers which often leads to so much misunderstanding. The idea was precious to her, that no one may think of me, that I may be forgotten and trodden underfoot as a grain of salt. In speaking of the Carmel, she speaks of virgin forests in which there grow flowers of a fragrance and brilliance unknown to the world. This touches upon one of the essential points of the life of the Christian in the world, of the life of the contemplative, and particularly of the teaching of Saint Therese. I never had any understanding for the contemplative life or for the role of contemplation in our life until one day, many years ago, I came across a remark in the book of letters by Father Peter Lippert. This letter was written to an old priest stricken with a chronic infirmity. The priest had apparently complained that he was of no use to anybody anymore. Father Lippert, in his reply, said something to the effect that in order to be of use, one did not at all have to be useful in a practical sense. He went so far to say that if he were alone in the desert and with his body in a state of disintegration, his life might be most useful. This remark struck a chord in me. It was one of those simple truths which one seems to discover accidentally. This fact, namely that nothing which is directed either towards or away from God can ever be lost, His inestimable preciousness in the economy of the universe, of every hidden movement, of every human soul. This law of the conservation of charity, this is the central idea of the contemplative life. At the same time, it forms the center of Christian teaching. Christianity stands and falls with it. This idea is a scandal and a contradiction in the face of all present-day philosophies of life. It scandalizes those who see religion as useful in terms of interpersonal relationships, those who think of the communion of saints as a general brotherhood week, and those who want to apply the laws of advertising to the church. Compared with people in her and our country, Therese had peculiar sense of statistics. 0 by itself has no value, but put it alongside 1, it becomes potent, always provided it is put on the proper side, after and not before. With this goes an immediate, almost natural awareness of the infinite value of each single person, an idea which occurs over and over again from her earliest to her last recorded sayings. When speaking of what God has done for her sister Celine, she remarks that He is prouder of what He has done in her soul, of her littleness and poverty, than of having created millions of suns and the whole expanse of the heavens. It should be noted that on such occasions she speaks no longer in clichés, but in a daring and, in a sense, shocking language. Think of such imagery in comparison with our current concept of the human person and of the cosmos. Suddenly, you have something like an optical illusion. The sweet and little French girl disappears, and before you stands an immense, awe-inspiring, timeless figure, a comparison of the prophets, the apostles, the fathers of the church, and of the great mystics of the Middle Ages. But this lasts only for a moment. Back you are again in the 19th century, in Alençon, France, in a comfortable bourgeoisie family, with the atmosphere of velvet, embroidery, plaster statues, knickknacks, little garden houses, fishing expeditions, flowers in the meadows, and games on the swing. The photographs look like all children's photographs from our parents' generation, with the expensive Sunday dress and the stiff pose. There has never been a milieu or a period more contrary to our common idea of greatness. There was nothing extraordinary in the fact that she wanted to be a religious. Both her father and her mother had tried to enter the religious life. All her sisters were nuns. The only unusual thing about her was that she was impatient. By persistency and a combination of circumstances, she was able to enter the Carmel at the age of 15. The Carmelites are a contemplative, enclosed order. Daily life begins in the summer at 5, in the winter at 6 in the morning, and ends at 10:30 in the evening. There is a rigid schedule of prayer, meditation, and work, with little time for meals or recreation. Sister Therese was stationed at various times in various places, in the refectory, in the sacristy, in the linen room, as a doorkeeper, and as a porter. Now, first of all, you must visualize a child who leaves the happy atmosphere of the bourgeoisie home with the eager impatience of the lover unable to wait, and who finds herself on arriving at the goal for long stretches of time devoid of any glimmer of inner satisfaction. Then there is the story of the Mother Superior. A good deal of historical controversy has arisen as to whether that woman really was the tormenting psychopath she appears from some descriptions, or whether she was just an ordinary fault-finding chief who did not understand the people living under her rule. I am inclined to believe the first of these two possibilities. From clinical experience, it is hard to see how the stories which have been told about her could have been invented. Actually, it does not make much difference. All that matters is the general setting. It was in this setting that the young girl conceived a plan and carried it out. In order to present the basic idea of her plan to modern readers, it is best to look first at our own setting. To begin with, every one of us has to make a choice between the demands of God and the demands of the world. Actually, neither of them allows half measures. God was the first totalitarian. He insists on having every one of us completely. We are not to say yes, yes, or no, no. We are to be hot or cold. He will not hear of anything in between. The world has also been totalitarian in its demands from the beginning. What we commonly call the world manifests itself socially more and more in such a manner that less and less half measures are permitted to the individual human person. We have to surrender totally. To begin with, the advancement in the field of techniques, not only mechanical but also organizatory, brings with it danger of dehumanization, of a cooling off of our planet, not physically as happened long ago, but in terms of relationship of man to man. The frightening efficiency of the social systems of certain dictator countries is a particular blatant example of this. Secondly, with the mastering of the forces of nature, there goes, paradoxically, a greater awareness of the fortuitousness, the hit or miss in the existence of every individual. Curiously enough, present-day man is not reassured by the great decrease of the death rate. Everyone is afraid he might belong to the encouragingly small percentage of people who are going to die tomorrow. We become like actuaries who are able to work out with ingenious formulas to the third decimal how many people in a given area will have bricks fall on their heads during the coming year. The fact, however, that nobody knows whether he himself will be the recipient of such a brick becomes disquieting in the measure in which our applied mathematics improve. Thirdly, the potential power of one single individual has increased to an incredible degree. This is another of the possible drawbacks of technical progress. It has often seemed to me that the idea of a push-button war is so fascinating to people because it is a stark symbol of how much one person might be able to accomplish today just by moving his little finger. The three examples I have just outlined come down to something rather simple. They illustrate the way in which our present-day world, the social structure of the 20th century, endangers our charity, our confidence, and our humility. Now, in the face of these two conflicting totalitarian demands, that of Christ and that of the world in which we live, what do we do? To be totalitarian is a great thing. Nietzsche's insane prediction that no enemy of Christianity would ever have dreamed of the existence of such heavy guns came true to an uncanny degree, even if it came true in a way in which he did not mean it at all. The earth is in convolutions. It is big stuff, all right. Where in this world is the big stuff which we can use in the face of all this? Now this is where we have to come back to Therese's plan. Point number 1. She would say if she were here with us right now, don't use any big stuff, use little stuff. An all-out surrender does not have to be spectacular in worldly terms. Not everybody can be a Saint Paul or a Saint Joan of Arc. Only a few people are meant to be stoned, suffer shipwreck, spend a night and a day in the depth of the sea, or don armor and ride at the head of a regiment. As a matter of fact, with the world becoming more and more totalitarian, a Christian should think twice before he goes in for the big stuff. There is in everybody's life, in every place and at every moment, a lot of small stuff around which would provide excellent material for sanctity if one only exploited it. Céline said about Therese that she revealed her strength in a multitude of slight, almost microscopic acts. At first sight, you are disappointed. It sounds like the Boy Scouts rule, which incidentally most of us don't follow either, perhaps because it is too far below our spiritual level. To understand its real meaning, you have to study her biographies. It would go far beyond the scope of this essay to relate those microscopic acts in detail. No single incident illustrates sufficiently what is meant by all this. There is the story of the sister towards whom she felt an instinctive antipathy. There is the story of the old sister whom she looked after and who found fault with her endlessly. There is the series of events during the influenza epidemic in the convent. And there are many more stories. With all this go the misinterpretations and rebuffs to which she was subjected every day, the coldness, both emotional and physical, of the atmosphere, and those endless nights without sleep, with physical and mental torture, with the torment of doubt and the withdrawal of all natural and supernatural consolation. With my heart, weary of the enveloping darkness, tries to find some rest and strength in the thought of an everlasting life to come, my anguish only increases. It seems that the darkness itself, borrowing the voice of the unbeliever, cries mockingly, "You dream of a land of light and fragrance. You believe that the creator of these wonders will be forever yours. You think to escape one day from the mists in which you now languish. Hope on, hope on. Look forward to death. It will give you not what you hope for, but a night darker still, the night of utter nothingness." This was the raw material out of which miraculously she made her little nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. This is the same Therese of whom one of the sisters said, when she did not show up for recreation, "There will be no laughing today." So our Therese is not here. Ivan Karamazov, that fictitious and very real contemporary of Saint Therese, says, "I could never understand how one could love one's neighbor. It is precisely the neighbor, the one who is physically close to us, whom one cannot possibly love, in my opinion. At best, one can love those who are far away. The love of Christ for human beings, in my opinion, a miracle which cannot be realized on this earth. All right, he was God, but we are no gods. Let us assume, for instance, that I suffer deeply, and that another one never realizes how much I suffer. Well, he is just another one, and not I. Moreover, a human being will only rarely admit the suffering of another one, as if there were something like a rank involved. Why does he not admit it? What do you think? Well, perhaps because I have a bad smell or a stupid face, or because I stepped on his toe. And with all this, there is a difference between suffering and suffering. Ordinary suffering, which humiliates me, let us say hunger, might still be acknowledged by my benefactor. But very rarely will he acknowledge in me a higher form of suffering, for example, suffering for an idea. The moment he sees me, he'll find that my face does not at all resemble the face he had imagined a man who suffers for an idea ought to have. He'll withdraw all his good deeds, and mind you, he won't do it out of a bad heart. One can love one's neighbor in an abstract way, occasionally, perhaps even from afar, but in close contact, almost never. He stated the problem very neatly. The obstacles to a Christ-like life are trivial, almost ridiculous, often in the nature of psychological subtleties. Therefore, the method too had to be one of trivialities and psychological subtleties. Therese's so-called little way is the exact complement to Ivan's remarks. He has a clear notion of what seemed to him a hopeless position, and she evolved a strategy. The fact that the fictitious Ivan and the historical Therese are contemporaries is perhaps not as accidental as it looks. Ivan says it is easy to love human beings in a far-away, abstract manner. There are, as everybody can see, great possibilities for self-deception. And the general cultural atmosphere of the 19th century, as of the 20th, lends itself particularly to this kind of thing. If the gospel appeals to you, it is easy to come out against general social injustice, against the exploitation of the poor, in favor of pacifism, ethical vegetarianism, or other isms. But it is 1,000 times harder to tackle problems of hostility or coldness or injustice in the relationship with those with whom you are in everyday contact. It is also much less spectacular. Tolstoy is a case in point. As a husband and family man, he was often torn by hatred and injustice. For many reasons, he somehow never came around to parting with his possessions. And it seems almost that, in the same measure in which these conflicts mounted, he went into the big sweeping issues of the society of his day and became more radical in his demands. Salovey was perhaps the first one to see the pitfall in this. He himself came out on such issues as capital punishment and anti-Semitism. He sacrificed even his professorship, the source of his livelihood, for his convictions. But he saw, in a purely externalized morality, such a grave danger that he branded Tolstoy's way as the way of the Antichrist. This is strong language. It is heresy, he said, to preach vegetarianism to the masses. But after his death, it became known that he himself had lived a strictly ascetic life and a life of voluntary poverty. All this only goes to show how highly topical Saint Therese is. Now, to point number 2 of her program. Be in your relationship to God like a little child. Unless you be converted and become as little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Ah, you say, that little child. Has not modern psychology done away for good with that picture of the utterly loving, utterly confident, and utterly humble child? A poetic myth. It is true, children do hate, they do distort, and they are proud. The ambivalence, the two-pronged nature of our feelings, develops early. But we all have gone through an early phase of complete and utter dependence. We were helpless without our mother. We needed her in an all-out way. We could do nothing without her. We simply had to trust her. There was no alternative. We could not foresee future hazards and had to leave all those blindly to her foresight. That earliest little man, that archechild of our ontogenic story, is still alive in every one of us. To regress to it on the natural plane in our relationship with people is a most serious form of neurosis. To find our way back to it on the supernatural plane in our relationship with God is the highest degree of maturity. As one whom the mother caresses, so will I comfort you, says God. Isaiah 66:13. But for this to be possible, there has to be a child on the receiving end. One minor aspect of this spiritual childhood is often overlooked. This is a sort of intellectual simplification. One does not at all need to be anti-intellectual, but one must look out not to become top-heavy. Many of us read entire libraries of philosophy and theology from St. Augustine to Karl Adam. Before we know it, we have attained a sort of mental obesity instead of spiritual growth. Saint Therese first read quite a few spiritual treatises, not always the most sophisticated ones, it seems. Later, she read only the Imitation and the Gospel, then only the Gospel, and in her latest phase, she did not read anything at all. She said at one time that not 3 consecutive minutes of her life passed without her thinking of God. But that does not mean that she speculated. These thoughts were movements of the heart. Saint Seraphim, the greatest modern saint of the Eastern Church, who died 40 years before she was born, and in whose life and teaching there are a few striking parallels, confined himself for years to a prayer consisting of one sentence. He repeated it thousands of times a day. It was the sentence uttered by the publican in the parable of the proud Pharisee. Point number 3 of her way is often entirely neglected. That is her devotion to the Holy Face. It will be remembered that she adopted, in addition to child Jesus, the name of the Holy Face. Apart from the quotations referring to the child, one of her favorite Bible passages was the famous one from Isaiah. There is no beauty in him nor comeliness, and we have seen him, and there was no sightliness. Despised and the most abject of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with infirmity, and his look was as it were hidden and despised, whereupon we esteemed him not. At one time she said that all her piety had been based on those words. Her relationship to the supernatural attained such a degree of concreteness and immediacy that she was able to see in all forms of suffering the suffering of our Lord. The closer to her the sufferer was, the more abject the form of suffering were, the more real became his identity. There was a most extraordinary interpretation of concrete situation and supernatural meaning. They are nearly fused into one image. This is the aspect of her life most difficult to understand for most of us. It comes out most clearly in the way she experienced her father's illness. It is easy to approach things of this sort with psychoanalytic concepts, but this means to miss the point entirely. There is in our relationship to the saints a limitless possibility for fooling ourselves. We all admire Saint Francis of Assisi. When we come to analyze what attracts us to him, we may find that he represents to us a fantasy of escape rather than a true hero. He may actually appeal to the Rousseauist who is still alive in every one of us. In the mind of many people, he has become a kind of nature boy who lives as the friend of birds and squirrels and does not have to pay any income tax. The fact that he experienced the agony of our Lord is a small print footnote. Moreover, there is no need to do anything about it, because our station in life is such that we would not possibly all try to be Saint Francis's. I have a particular personal devotion to a Pastor Schneider, a Lutheran minister who died in Buchenwald concentration camp. Father Steinwender, a priest from Austria and a fellow prisoner of Pastor Schneider, tells us his story. During a solemn ceremony in the camp, Pastor Schneider refused to take his cap off to the swastika flag. He was dragged into the bunker, the ill-famed prison within the camp, which he was destined not to leave. For 13 months he suffered the tortures of a sadistic form of separate treatment. Prisoners who temporarily shared his cell were overwhelmed by the spiritual greatness of this man. In spite of a diet which was scarcely enough to maintain life, he refused on Friday, the day of the death of our Lord, all food. In front of the one-story bunker was the big gathering place on which prisoners had to appear twice daily, in the morning and in the evening, to be counted. On the high feast days, one would suddenly, during the quiet of counting, hear the powerful voice of Pastor Schneider through the gates of the bunker. Like a prophet, he made a feast day sermon. That is to say, he tried to begin it. On Easter Sunday morning, for example, we heard suddenly the powerful words, "Thus speaks the Lord, I am the resurrection and the life." There the prisoners were standing in long rows, stirred to the innermost by the courage and tremendous willpower of a man. It was as if a voice from another world were calling them, as if they heard the voice of John the Baptist from the dungeons of Herod, the mighty voice of a prophet calling in the desert. He would never say more than a few sentences. Then one heard the truncheons of the guards beating him, or the blow of a fist throw his tortured body into the corner of the bunker. Since they could make no impression on a conviction which was of the hardness of granite, they declared him a madman who who had to be silenced by beating. For over a year, he bore the tortures of the bunker until even his strength succumbed to brute force. There was nothing whole on his entire body when he was carried dead from the bunker. But even with Pastor Schneider, I have a first-class excuse. I am not in a concentration camp, and I am not called to witness. There is nothing here, and now calling upon me to follow his example. With Therese, it is different. With her, no excuse is possible. Pope Benedict XV says, "There is a call to the faithful of every nation, no matter what may be their age, sex, or state of life, to enter wholeheartedly into the little way which led Sister Theresa to the summit of heroic virtue." It sounds easy. Depend on God like a little child. Trust Him blindly no matter what happens. Use the inconspicuous events and situations of everyday life as material for sanctification. Do it in obscurity, and in view of all suffering, think of that face. It is just about the most difficult thing to do. Littleness, as she understood it, and mediocrity, as we live it. I could not conceive of two more contrary ways of life. It often occurred to me that poor tortured Nietzsche, with his violent cry of "No, no," was in the eyes of God closer to her "Yes, yes" than we are. But then there is that terrible word of their fruits by which you shall know them. I have known the boys who continued with the revaluation of all values. I have known them at high school and at the university. I have run into them in the most unlikely places. From all this arose such an army of lying and murder as the world has perhaps never seen before. Saint Therese, like Nietzsche, the old artilleryman, was fond of military metaphors. She spoke of an army she was going to raise and of conquests she was going to make. I have come to know her followers too. There too, I must say, it was in the most unlikely places and the most unexpected situations that I met them. I am tempted to write, instead of this essay, the stories of all the various persons I have met who are attracted to her. But this would make a book all by itself. As a composite picture, it would constitute a sort of life of the saint, although beginning quite some time after her death. Her death occurred in complete obscurity on September 30th, 1897. 2 days later, Tolstoy, in his faraway Yasnaya Polyana, made the following entry in his diary. I imagined vividly what a joyful, peaceful, and completely free life this would be, to be able to dedicate oneself entirely to God. That is, if one intended in all situations which life presents only to accept His will, during illness, when one has been insulted, in humiliation, in suffering, in all temptations, and in death. In that case, death would be nothing but the taking on of a new task. There he was, that great and tragic genius of our time, struggling for a goal to which he had come so much closer than most of us, clearly beholding it, yet far removed. And Sister Therese had made it.